When Americans tell the story of the Revolution, we usually look north and east to the infamous 13 and the major battles: Boston, Philadelphia, Valley Forge, Yorktown. But in the spring of 1781, while the war was moving toward its final act in Virginia, another revolutionary campaign was unfolding, far to the south and on the Gulf Coast. The Continental Army didn't win this one, and George Washington wasn't even there. And yet, what happened at Pensacola, Florida, helped weaken Britain's position in North America and change the future of the southern borderlands. Hello, fellow historians. I'm Andrea Henderson, and this is the story of the Siege of Pensacola and of Fort George, a public history site that reminds us the American Revolution was not only an American story. Today, the public history anchor for this is Fort George Memorial Park in Pensacola, Florida. The original Fort George was a British fort built in 1778 on Gage Hill. It was built to protect Pensacola from Spanish attack. It was the largest of three British fortifications on the hill, supported by the Queen's Redoubt and the Prince of Wales Redoubt. Pensacola was not just a small coastal town. In 1781, it was Britain's principal stronghold in West Florida and one of the most important military positions on the Gulf Coast. By the time the siege began, Spain had entered the war against Britain, not because Spain necessarily shared the ideological goals of American independence, but because Britain's global war created an opportunity. Spain wanted to recover territory, secure the Gulf of Mexico, and weaken British imperial power. So while American and British forces fought across the Carolinas and Virginia, Bernardo de Galvez, the Spanish governor of Louisiana, moved against British positions in the Gulf. Galvez had already taken British ports in the Mississippi River Valley and at Mobile in what today is Alabama. Pensacola was the major prize that remained. In March 1781, Spanish forces began the campaign against Pensacola. The campaign opened with Spanish naval and land operations around the bay and Santa Rosa Island. Then came one of the most dramatic moments of the siege. When Spanish naval officers hesitated to sail into the bay, which was under tremendous British fire, Galvez reportedly pressed forward alone aboard his own brig, the Galvestown. It's an act that is remembered by the phrase "yo solo," or "I alone." After that daring move, the Spanish fleet had no choice but to enter the bay, and reinforcements arrived soon after from Mobile, New Orleans, and Havana. So to be clear, this wasn't just a side skirmish. Historian Albert Harman notes that the siege involved roughly 10,000 combatants. The British garrison numbered around 2,000 defenders, while the combined Spanish and French forces eventually reached about 8,000 men. One of the valuable sources we have for this campaign is Francisco de Miranda's Diary of the Siege. Miranda later became famous for his role in Latin American independence, but in 1781, he was part of the Spanish expedition from Havana. His diary shows Pensacola as an Atlantic world military operation involving fleets, soldiers, reinforcements, supply problems, and imperial coordination across the Caribbean and Gulf. In other words, Pensacola was not isolated from the Revolution. It was part of the same global war. The key British position was Fort George, overlooking the town, and above it were the Queen's Redoubt and the Prince of Wales Redoubt. They were defensive works designed to protect the high ground. Spanish engineers began siege works and trenches, slowly moving closer to the British lines. And then, on May 8, 1781, the turning point came. A Spanish shell struck near the powder magazine of the Queen's Redoubt. The explosion devastated the position, killing or wounded many of its defenders and making the British line impossible to hold. So British General John Campbell raised the white flag, and Fort George surrendered to Spanish forces. Pensacola fell. After the siege, Fort George was renamed Fort San Miguel, but the Spanish government didn't continue to use the fort in a major way, and the site deteriorated. Over time, the original military landscape disappeared beneath the growing city. In the 1970s, during the era of the American bicentennial, though, the site received renewed attention. Archaeologists excavated parts of Gage Hill and found remains connected to the British and Spanish forts, including part of the moat, a powder magazine, and vaulted rooms. Fort George Memorial Park now marks the location, and the site appears in the National Register documentation as the site of Fort George and Fort San Miguel. So the site itself tells two stories: the 1781 military story and the modern preservation story. There are also two ways to interpret Pensacola's importance in the Revolution. The first is the traditional American Revolution interpretation. So from this view, the fall of Pensacola helped the Patriot cause because it weakened Britain, removed major British base from West Florida, and forced Britain to fight a wider war. Spain's pressure in the Gulf stretched British military attention and resources. But there's a second interpretation as well. Pensacola was also a Spanish imperial victory. Galvez wasn't necessarily fighting to create the United States. He fought for his own personal reasons, obviously. He was eager to prove his merits and secure his position in his future. But Spain was pursuing its own Bourbon imperial interests, recovering territory, securing the Mississippi River and the Gulf Coast, and reducing British power in North America. This makes Pensacola both important and interesting because it forces us to see the revolution as something larger than 13 colonies fighting for independence. It was also a global imperial war, according to some modern historians. It was fought by Britain, France, Spain, indigenous allies, colonial militias, regular soldiers, sailors, and local communities across a much wider map. For these reasons, Fort George would be valuable for a field trip, or even a virtual field trip. For students, this site complicates the usual Revolution map. It asks students to look beyond Boston and Yorktown and ask, who else shaped the outcome of this war? And why did Spain help the American cause? And how do public history sites decide which stories become visible? If you're a teacher or a homeschool parent, you could use the American Battlefield Trust's tour recommendation tool to build a Revolutionary War heritage route around Pensacola and nearby Gulf Coast sites. Students could compare the modern battlefield map, the Fort George Memorial Park interpretation, the National Register documentation, and primary source accounts like Miranda's diary that I mentioned earlier. So Fort George Memorial Park is more than a small site in Pensacola. It's a reminder that the American Revolution was fought on a much larger stage than many Americans remember. In the spring of 1781, as Cornwallis moved toward the Virginia campaign that would end at Yorktown, Spain was winning its own victory at Pensacola. Pensacola doesn't replace Yorktown in the story of the Revolution, but it does change the map. And once that map gets bigger, so does our understanding of the war. Thank you for watching.